As I told you, I love the sound of my voice. And I don't like to preach without a good echo. All right, part 3 in our postured series this morning. Again, we've been talking about worship. We've been talking about that we are insisting on being a church that insists on a posture over a program. And we are going to continue in that theme this morning. So letting someone down after making a promise because I don't have the energy or I no longer have the time that I thought I would have, that's one of my very least favorite experiences in the world. Particularly if it's in relation to my wife or my kids or my best friends, my parents, the people who matter the very, very most to me. When my kids were small, there was nothing more heart-wrenching than seeing their face frown and become sad and disappointed and even disillusioned with me when I'd have to say, I know I said we would do it today, but we're going to have to do it tomorrow. The more I love a person, it seems the more I want to always have enough to give them what they need, what they deserve, and even what they desire from me. And it's crushing when I can't do that. Furthermore, it's an equally horrible feeling when I've given them what I want to give them to make sure I get the job done, as opposed to what they desire or what they need or what they have asked from me. And we've talked about this a little bit, but we know in our lives there are times where people need something or want something specific, something they love, but it's not necessarily our favorite, so we give them what they love, hoping that will be enough. Leaves them disappointed, leaves them wanting more. It's an attempt to try to serve others by ultimately serving ourselves first. I'm sure some of you can relate to these experiences, patterns, habits. Interesting then isn't it that this isn't our response when we don't God our hearts. When we push God to tomorrow, when we give God our leftovers, when we worship God according to our preferences and what we would like Him to want, we really have no problem, no hesitation. God's often approached, it seems, as a task rather than a person, with thoughts and passions and preferences and even emotions. And because then God is approached as a task, we too easily tell Him in one way or another, sorry God, I'm just going to have to give you what you want and what you desire when I have a bit more time and when I have a bit more energy. I can't do it right now because I'm already extremely invested in all kinds of countless other things. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Letters, Uncle Screwtape, a high-ranking demon, throughout the book is giving various instructions to Wormwood, a lower-ranking demon. And in one particular section, one of his encouragements to his nephew is that he would use a tactic of what we could call misplaced extreme investment. Misplaced extreme investment in many other things to draw the human that he's assigned to away from God. Uncle Screwtape teaches all extremes except extreme devotion to the enemy are to be encouraged. Now remember, in the Screwtape Letters, the enemy is God. All extremes, then, except extreme devotion to God, are to be encouraged. Encourage them to give deeply to everything they possibly can, other than God. The point, of course, is getting a Christian person to become extremely devoted to all sorts of things will cause that devotion to God to be left wanting. Now, additionally, because God is often approached as a task rather than a person, it's not uncommon for us to have very little feeling when He's not given our best, when He's given our leftovers, if we give Him anything at all. We don't feel that same level of disappointment with telling God we'll have to do it tomorrow as we do to our kids, or our wife, or our best friend, or our church family, or wherever it may be. But worshiping God like that, with very little regard for His passions, preferences, what He wants from us, is ultimately, as we've been talking about, to worship Him according to our preference, according to ourself, rather than according to what He has revealed that He'd want. So last week I mentioned that I was going to show you a piece of scripture warning us about worshiping according to our preferences as often as I can throughout this series. And so we're going to do that again today. This isn't our main preaching text. This is sort of the warm-up to what I really want to say. But we're going to look at for a moment at 2 Chronicles 26, verses 16 through 21. Let me give you a little context on what we're going to look at here. So this is a little story about King Uzziah. King Uzziah was a long-reigning king, 52 years, I think it says. He was really successful. He was a great warrior, brilliant military mind. He built up physically the buildings of the city. He was very accomplished, did a lot of good things. But then we pick up in verse 16, and we read that, "But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God." And here we go. "He entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord followed him in. They confronted King Uzziah and they said, 'It's not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you've been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God.' Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry. And while he was raging at the priests in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah the chief priest and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous, and banned from the temple of the Lord. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land." Uzziah had done a lot right. And we find out that his pride got the best of him. And his pride somehow led him to believe that God was okay with being worshipped according to Uzziah's preferences rather than what God had asked and what God had set up and put in place. And so for us then, giving God our leftovers because we don't have anything else, and that's what we want to give right now, that's all the time we have to give right now, obviously isn't what God desires. God desires his people to give him their best sacrifice according to what he has asked us to give him. And so this morning then, because that is a human tendency, because that is a struggle of consumeristic North Americans in our posture of worship towards God, I am going to show you another way in which we can posture ourselves as worshipers, as priests, as we talked about last week, who give to God what he desires. And particularly, we're going to zoom in on a situation, particularly when we feel pressured, when we feel weary, when we feel tired of life, to the degree that we would rather tell God maybe tomorrow or sometime next week, or when this storm in my life passes, sometime when I'm not stretched so thin, then I'll worship well. You can turn to Psalm 57 if you would like to follow in your own Bibles this morning. We're going to read the whole thing, beginning in verse 1. "Have mercy on me, my God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I cry out to God Most High, to God who vindicates me. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends forth his love and faithfulness. I'm in the midst of lions. I'm forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be all over the earth. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they've fallen into it themselves. My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be all over the earth. I love the way that this psalm reminds us that when we give God our best, when life is the worst, God is glorified. King David is credited as the author of this psalm. And the challenge in David's life that likely inspired this psalm was his evasion of King Saul by taking shelter in a cave. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 22. And the psalm describes what we could classify as a real brutal day in David's life. A time when he likely felt like he didn't have all that much to give. And maybe a day that we would consider to be a day when giving time or energy to the worship of God was maybe not the best use of his time. Because he had bigger fish to fry. He had more pressing priorities. Yet this psalm reveals that even in that circumstance, even in that very bad, awful day, David wanted to give to God. And he wanted to give his best, not his leftovers. He wanted to give what God was worthy of. So we ask then, what lesson or lessons might David's words and his experience offer us as we as a church and as individuals seek to give God our best, even when life may be giving us its worst? So I've got 2 points for you this morning. Our first is this: we worship what we ultimately depend on. We worship what we ultimately depend on. We'll look at the first 5 verses again. Have mercy on me, my God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I cry out to God Most High, to God who vindicates me. He sends from heaven and he saves me. Rebuking those who hotly pursue me, God sends forth his love and his faithfulness. I'm in the midst of lions. I'm forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and sorrows whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be all over the earth. So maybe before any other lesson or takeaway is offered, maybe before any correction is made to our ideas or our postures, the most basic takeaway from this song is that worship flows from dependence. You worship what you ultimately depend on. And so if you want to give God your best rather than your leftovers, you want to assess whether or not you're ultimately depending on God. Now, you can depend on other things. I depend on my wife. I depend on Brianne. There's lots of people I depend on. But I got to make sure not ultimately. You see, if you trust yourself and you depend on yourself above all else, then you will give yourself the best of you. If you depend on the government or a social system or health care, then you will come to worship and give your attention and your affection and your thought life and your patterns and your devotion and your money and even your passion to those things. If you depend on high standards and morality and a great work ethic, you'll come to give your best to those things. Same with your beauty, same with your family, same with your money. So how do we tell what we're ultimately depending on? Is there a quick way to figure that out? Well, unfortunately, there is a fairly quick way to figure it out. It's just not that pleasant. Let's go through a crisis. Crisis always is a place to find out a little bit about ourselves. You've heard me say this a couple times the last couple of years. Crisis doesn't necessarily build character, it reveals it. And it reveals what we're ultimately depending on. In the case of David, his words in Psalm 57 come from crisis. As I mentioned, it's likely that he was being forced to take shelter in a cave while he was by himself and on the run from King Saul and his warriors. Now, interestingly, if we think about this, I think for some of us, and this isn't even a criticism, though it is a challenge, some of us would have probably found the cave and taken refuge in the cave and said, well, that's great. Then that's my ultimate dependence. I'm going to depend on this cave. It meets David's immediate need for shelter. It gives him a place to hide. It takes care of the most pressing issue. It didn't really cost him anything. He didn't have to work for it. It was just there. David could have said the cave, this creation of earth, this unexpected opportunity, well, I'm just going to depend on that because that seems to be working pretty good. But that wasn't the case for David. For David, the cave wasn't enough. The security that a refuge of earth could provide wasn't enough to gain his ultimate dependence. Rather, David believed God and only God would be his refuge. David believed that the shadow of God's wings was the only true, dependable hiding place. He believed that it was God who would save and God alone. He believed it was God whose love and faithfulness would be his answer and not lead him to utter disappointment. And so even though David is in a horrible situation, even though he has every reason to feel overwhelmed, exhausted, stressed, and running on empty, he doesn't say, I'll get back to you tomorrow, God, when I've dealt with this. He doesn't say, oh, you don't know the kind of day I've had. I can't right now. I don't have the capacity. David does just the opposite. In the same breath as the description of his problem, he recites his dependence. And then almost like a burst of passion, as the dependence and the struggle contrast and wrestle, springs worship. David moves from saying, I'm in the midst of lions and I'm living amongst ravenous beasts to, but be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be all over the earth. May you be lifted higher than anything. May your weight and your significance be felt and known in every corner and crevice of the earth. David declares, yes, God, I'm concerned about my life. I'm concerned about my enemies. I'm at the end of my rope and it doesn't look good, but I depend on you, therefore I worship. My worship will flow from my dependence. Ultimate dependence on God empowers, gives David a spring, a flow, a gush of worship. God, I'll give you what you deserve. I'll give you what it seems like I shouldn't have. I'll give you my impassioned praise. I'll give you my undivided attention because you are perfectly dependable. Consider if David's dependence had been on himself, if it had been on a friend, if it had been on the cave, if it had been on Israel's social systems. The worship likely never happens. But that's not what David depends on. He depends on God, and that dependence gives way to praise. Now, the type of worship that David gives is really important to notice. So we're going to camp on the sacrifice that David gives in this passage. You see, worship is giving God the best of who we are, even when life is the worst. Now, this isn't all worship is, okay? But this is a portion of worship, is giving God the very best of who we are, even when life is the very worst. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples, for great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, there's the refrain again, O God, above the heavens. And let your glory be all over the earth. Because God's worship is so often given when and how we feel like it, Giving God our very best rather than our leftovers is almost an afterthought for many of us. Often. Worship in general, and what I mean by that is like the action of worship, like how we worship. When we come to church, what we do when we worship is so second nature, it's so habit, it's so routine, that for many of us, I'm not sure we even think about on a regular basis what we're doing, what we're singing, what we're praying, how we're standing, how we're moving, how we're posturing ourselves. Us evangelicals for so long have lived and functioned as if there's no right way to worship. So we just do whatever the moment inspires. Just come in here and just kind of feel it. Like, whew, that song. Oh, that prayer. Or other times, nothing. And when we live like the actions of our worship do not matter, because there's no standard, then God gets that kind of low standard. He gets that leftover, habitual, going through the motion, routine practice of praise. And especially when life is hard. Because if we come in when life is hard and we're waiting for the song to get the hips moving or something, to loosen up our joints, probably not going to happen. Especially if the week was brutal. Especially if the relationship that we have loved has fallen apart. Especially if we don't have enough money. Especially if we don't have enough health. Especially if our kids are struggling. Especially if life is giving us the worst. And then we justify the leftover, half-warm, cold in the middle, shepherd's pie in a Ziploc container worship. And we say, I think I just need to focus on me right now. We are so self-obsessed. In our culture, we repeatedly put ourselves first as a sign of wisdom. And that may be good wisdom in certain situations. Like, of course, I wouldn't say just run yourself ragged. But, newsflash, it is never going to hurt you to put God first. Ever. Putting God first ahead of yourself is never going to put you at a disadvantage. Ever. So you can put everything else behind, but not God. It's never going to hurt us to give God our very, very best, even if life is the very worst, which is exactly what David does in Psalm 57. When life is giving David the worst, David gives God his best. And so you'll notice after the refrain of verse 5, moving into verse 6, David records a bit more detail of what he's facing. He lists a bit more of what was the worst, and then he begins to give away. And what was the best that David could give? He begins to give himself. He begins to return to God the glory that God has given him. So look at verses 7 and 8 isolated. My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. So in verse 7, David declares that his heart is steadfast. He says it twice. And that he will sing and he will make music. The word steadfast here in the original language is speaking of something that's steady or well prepared. And David's saying, I am going to give my full attention now to offering you my very best praise. My heart is ready. My heart is prepared. I am ready to rock and roll for you, God. And then in verse 8, David says something remarkable. He says, in order to give God his praise, he's got to do something. And so he says, awake my soul. Awake my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. Now, to bring out the significance of this verse, we've got to get technical for a moment. So stick with me. So the Hebrew word that is translated as soul, awake my soul here, is the word kabod. K-A-B-O-D. Now, in other places in the Bible, this word is translated as glory. And in some Bible translations, it is also translated as glory. So let me show you the ESV. Verse 8, awake my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre, I will awaken the dawn. Time to praise God, so awake my glory. In my opinion, glory is a better translation than soul. I'm an NIV guy, but I like this translation better. The word kabod, glory, literally means weight or heaviness. The idea behind it when you're applying it to a person, even God, is that it's your significance, it's your importance, it's your splendor. Now, for those of us that grew up in maybe a real legalistic, heavy-handed Christian context, maybe you were constantly told to humble yourself and be more humble and be more humble, bow down and be pathetic. And so we don't ever think of ourselves as having glory. We actually do. We do have significance. And we do have importance, and we do have splendor. Your kabod is what you are tangibly best at. It's the significance that you carry that's unique and special to you. It's the place where your interests and your giftings and your skills and your time and your disposition and your education and your discipline, they all intersect to give you your significance, to give you your importance, to give you your weight. And so we could say that, yeah, the word soul fits, deep from your soul, from this center of your will and who you are. I just think glory sounds better. It's evocative. To give God your glory. Wow. So if we take this rich meaning of kabod, translate it as soul or better glory, what we find David is saying is, I am determined, steadfast, and prepared to call the very best parts of me to wake up. And I am going to give the very best of me, the very best that I have to offer, even what I can classify as my glory. I am going to return it to the one who gave it to me in the first place, the one who is deserving of all glory, including mine. And so how does David do it? How does he give his glory away? With music. He awakens his glory with his harp and lyre. Now you remember, if you know David's story, David was a tremendous musician. I read this week he's the greatest songwriter who ever lived. We're still singing his songs. Tremendous musician. His playing was anointed. It ministered to people. It pushed back evil. There was weight, significance in David's ability to create music. It was glorious. And so that's then what he determines to give back. David returns the glory that he has been given for the sake of God. Now, if we apply this then to ourselves in 2022, it's not often our glory that God receives. It's not regularly our practice to become steadfast in our insistence that God gets the very best part of me. And a major reason for this, and I've already commented on it, is because we are committed to giving the best parts of ourselves to other things. We give our glory to our work. We give our glory to our children. We give our glory to our hobby. We give our glory to our anxiety. We give our glory to our fear. We give our glory to our pain. We give our glory to the persons whose approval we most desire. We give our glory to learning and education, believing that it will get us and keep us ahead. We give our glory to attitudes and practices, personalities. We give our glory to being hard and harsh and demanding. And this, of course, only becomes more of our pattern when life gets hard, that we'll give everything our glory but God. And if we just pause for even a moment right now and consider how steadfast our heart is to give God our very best. When life is its very worst, when life was the worst it's ever been for you, how hard was it to give your glory away? Hard. So hard. Me too. So hard. It's hard for me to give my glory away when I've had like a bad afternoon, let alone the worst season of my life. So if we take this principle, though, of I will give God my glory because I want his praise to come all over the earth. This is really where the rubber meets the road for us. Because God deserves our glory. He deserves our best always. Like, we're not negotiating that. That is a fact, Jack. He deserves it. But that's not always what we give, because that's not really our priority. Our hearts are not necessarily steadfast towards giving God what he's worthy of, because God will forgive us if we don't. And so all of this really comes down to who is your priority. What is your priority? Who and what? Who or what? None of this lesson from David's life will matter if that refrain, be exalted and let your glory be all over the earth, is not really our greatest priority. Which is really, really hard, because we're invested everywhere. For David, it was utmost importance, at least at this point in his life. David wasn't perfect. We're going to talk about how glad we are for Jesus in a moment. But at this point, that was the priority. And so thus in one single psalm he exclaims, be exalted, O God, be exalted, be lifted to the highest place, above the heavens, and let your glory come now all over the earth. You be lifted up, but come down upon us. David wasn't interested in talking about just his bad, awful day. He's got a refrain. Where's the refrain in our lives? David wasn't interested in posting on social media how brutal his day was. He'd tell you how brutal his day was, but he'd also tell you the desire of his heart. That even though there's a refrain. David wasn't most interested to know just how brutal his day at work was, how stressed he's been, how mistreated he was today, how brutal his job is, how horrible his neighbor is, how terrible that person he has to work with is. In the middle of it all, in the middle of the worst day, he gives God his best because that is his priority. And so as we move into the conclusion and some personal application, I think we need to ask, what is your priority? And me too. And so for some, this question is probably enough for you to consider today and take it with you and chew on it for a while. Because you may not feel that you can honestly say that God is your priority, that his worship, his exaltation, his lifting up above everything so his glory may come down, that is not necessarily your priority. So you've got to think about why not. That's okay. I mean, God deserves it, and he's calling us to that, so I'm challenging us to move in that direction. But I'm a human being, and I know that's not always my story, and it may not always be your story. And I can't force it on you, and even God won't force it on you. It's a personal decision. And so you've actually just got to take some time and think about, is God's praise my priority? Is his glory all over the earth my top priority? So there's your homework. But if you know that, yes, that is it. If you're there today, at least today, maybe not tomorrow, but you know you're there today because we're in church. Today's the day we intended to do this so we can go on. If you do want to posture yourself as one who exalts God above all things, but you don't feel like you do a very good job at it, but you know it's your heart's desire, then I think Psalm 57 offers two practical considerations which will not take us long to get through. But the first one is, what's your context? So if you want to give God your best, what's your context? And maybe more precisely, to stick with Psalm 57, what is hard in your life right now? What is so hard you wish it would stop? What is it that you can't wait for it to be over? Who is it that you just can't handle being with right now? Who's making your life exhausting? Whatever it is, whoever it is, don't underestimate how excellent that place is for God to be glorified if that is your priority. If His glory is truly your priority, then you are in a place right now, wherever that place is, where His glory can shine incredibly bright. You don't need to get out, which is the usual human attitude towards worship. You don't need to get through it so that you can worship. You don't need to move on to the next season or the next location or the next relationship or the next job out of the stress so that you can worship. You can refrain right in the dead center of it, and God can be glorified. Furthermore, sticking with context, you can ask, going all the way back to kind of the beginning of the meat of this message, what about that context invites you to depend on God in a deeper way? So in that context, what are you depending on? And if you can shift that dependence off of whatever it is onto God, then this is like the supercharged fuel for your turbo worship. The more you depend on God, the more that you get to that point where you fall on Him, believe in Him, trust in Him, anticipate Him, look for Him. I don't know why, but it births worship. What in your context invites dependence? On God above all else. Finally, in your context, what is your kabod? What's your glory? What's your gift? What's your significance? What's your weight? And what are you using it for? And how could we do like David and in this incredible prayer that's also sort of this sort of declaration to our own self? I love when David talks to himself. How can we awaken it for God's glory? Awaken, wake up glory. It's time to give back. Wake up what is best about you that you've been using for something else. Wake up. It's time to give back. What can you return back to God? I heard it said not that long ago that worship is ultimately about giving what has been held out, which is pretty good. It's giving the thing that we haven't quite let go of yet. And that may be our glory. There may be parts of us, our minds, our education, our giftings. This church needs help. You've all got glory to give. What are you giving it to? Now, I can't answer those questions for you, though I wish I could. But I do encourage you to consider them. And I prayerfully hope that as you engage these questions by the leading and the power of the Holy Spirit, that some truth on how God can become more lifted up in your life would become clearer, make more sense. And I also prayerfully hope that by considering what you're depending on and adjusting that so you can give God your best, that might just produce in you a new vitality in worship that maybe you've never known, or maybe you lost a long time ago and you've been trying to get it back for years and years and years. So you're singing harder, or you're lifting your hands higher to the sky, or whatever you're doing. But maybe it's rooted in that dependence that's going to fuel the vitality and the passion of your praise for Jesus Christ. Finally, I prayerfully hope you are compelled. Imagine if we would be compelled by the invitation to praise God. Compelled by this great and holy privilege to worship as priests before God. Giving Him our very best rather than what's left over, and even when life is the worst. For He and He alone deserves to receive your glory returned. And we wrap this up. My hope is that even for a moment, even for a taste, that the eternal song of heaven would fill our hearts, would fill our minds, and would fill our mouths today. We find it in Revelation 4 where they sing constantly. And what do they say? They say, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory, to give it back, and honor and power." So as we come to the table, there's a great transition here. I don't have time to give you the lesson here, but there's something in the Old Testament working into Jesus that's called typology, where you find what's called types of Christs. Things that point to Jesus, that show us who Jesus is, who he'll be, but then Jesus is better and he fulfills those things. So David is like a type of Christ. But David giving God his glory wasn't enough to sustain it perfectly forever and ever and ever. And so along comes a better king in the line of David named Jesus. And as Jesus sits in the garden just prior to his arrest, and he's communicating with his Father, John 17 says that Jesus says, "Father, the hour has come." We can say this is the worst day in Jesus' life, yeah? The hour has come. Life is going to give me its very worst. And what does he say? He says, "Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. In the very worst, I will give you my very best. Glorify me for your sake. Give me the glory that I might return the glory." And he does it faithful and he does it perfect. And so then we read, as Peter talks about, we talked about this last week, that through Jesus we now offer the acceptable sacrifices to God. It is through the perfect Jesus who has perfectly received the glory and distributed it back, who did it without falter or fail, and who now and forever gives God what God is deserving of. And we come through Jesus by way of his shed blood to participate in this holy act. That's why when we fail, we don't ultimately fail. That's the good news. But that's also why we want to jump on this ship, because we can return to God glory that I think is bigger than what we completely understand, because it is through Jesus that we give these acceptable sacrifices. Furthermore, Jesus is our example. He is the standard. He is the perfect human. He has shown us how to live. And so it's not just David who says when life is the worst, give God your best. Jesus shows us when life is the worst, pray that God would glorify you for the sake of his glory all over the earth.